Thank you very much. President Brennan, members of the board, esteemed faculty, and most of all, members of the Rutledge graduating class, congratulations. I want you to know that it's a distinct honor to stand here before you today. Shortly, each of you will walk across this stage, the very same stage I walked across over 20 years ago, to receive your hard-earned diplomas, which have been earned through hard work, tenacity, and stick-to-itiveness. I thus suggest to you that as you sit here today, you savor this moment. Take it all in. Breathe it in. Remember who you're sitting next to, so that in the years to come, you can conjure up the feelings you've had, the feelings of justifiable pride in the success you have attained. William Hughes Mulligan, the late William Hughes Mulligan, who was a dean of Fordham Law School, a former distinguished judge on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, a partner later on in his life with the distinguished firm of Skadden Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom, and more importantly, a sought-after dinner speaker, had the following words to say at a commencement address he delivered at Fordham University Law School in 1976. And this is what he said. While there is an obvious reason for the presence of students, faculty, administration, and of all of your friends and relatives here today, there is no satisfactory explanation, known to me at any rate, to justify a speech at this time. Commencement addresses are as much subject to ridicule as political orations. They are traditionally platitudinous and pedestrian, and I assure you that I have great respect for tradition. While I also have great respect for tradition, I hope to keep platitudes to a minimum, although I'll give you a few, as well as the length of this speech, so that you will be able to go out and celebrate this momentous occasion with your friends and your family. Since I am, as all of you will soon be, a graduate of this great law school, I want to tell you briefly what this school has meant to me in my life. 25 years ago, I was living in New York City with my wife Terry and our young son Daniel. At the time, as President Brennan said, I was driving a taxi cab, a yellow cab. In fact, I drove all night and my wife drove all day. Although, as you heard, my father was a distinguished lawyer, and my mother was also a lawyer, it was their philosophy, if you weren't going to school, you worked. So that's what we did. With some not so gentle prodding from my wife, I decided I'd take the law school admission test. I always thought about being a lawyer, but just had not gotten around to motivating myself to do so. Well, Terry took care of that. And she's here today, and she's been my partner, my most ardent supporter, and my biggest fan for over 30 years. And I just ask her to stand up. I surely would not be standing here before you today if I did not have her standing behind me, giving me a push from time to time. The results of that test, which I now forget, or at least choose to forget, were less than distinguished. Let's say this: law schools were not actively or in any other way seeking my presence. I thus, as some of you may have, obtained a law school directory, I think from Princeton at the time is where they sent it from, and scoured the pages looking for a school that might recognize my well-disguised brilliance. In doing so, I came across the Thomas M. Cooley Law School, a school in Lansing, Michigan, a new school, the dean of which was this guy Brennan, who it said in the pages was a former chief judge of the Michigan Supreme Court. Must be okay, I thought, and I obtained an application and sent it in. Much to my surprise, I was accepted. So Terry and I packed up our young son, got hold of a U-Haul truck, and drove out here to Lansing. I remember to this day arriving in Lansing in the late fall of 1976. I said, "This isn't a place you come for a vacation. You gotta have some business here." But I remember arriving, I think it was in one of those gloomy fall days that you've all experienced. And it was a late fall, as I said, of 1976. And I drove past the very building that we now stand. It's a much different building inside. We had no air conditioning here then, and the rugs were torn, and there was old benches. But it surely looked the same on the outside. And I said to myself, well, this is where I'm going to be spending the next 3 years of my life. Those 3 years turned out for me to be 3 of the most rewarding, happiest, and stimulating years of my life. Those 3 years provided me with a foundation for what to date has been a successful and, more importantly, a thoroughly enjoyable career. That foundation was provided to me, as it has been provided to each and every one of you, by the wonderful and dedicated professors, many of whom are on the stage today, and many of whom I had the good fortune to have as professors when I was here as a student. When I walked across this stage over 20 years ago and out of Cooley Law School for the last time as a student, I did not take the opportunity to thank any of these professors. I doubt at the time that I was able to appreciate just what it was they had provided me and had done for me. When as a young lawyer starting out and arguing a motion in a crowded motion part in New York with 150 motions on and an impatient judge, when it was my turn and I was making a point to the judge and he said to me, "So what?" And I was able to respond, I understood what Pete Jason was trying to do. I have come to understand what Phil Prygosky meant when he told me, "You won't remember most of the names of the cases, but what you'll remember is the theory and the reasoning that went into them." And he was, of course, quite right. I don't see him here today, but I will always remember my friend Dave Cotter, who bent the rules to give me an opportunity to argue to get on the National Moot Court team. In those days, as I recall, we had 2 rounds, and my partner and I had won in the morning round. And when it came time to argue in the afternoon, he was nowhere to be found. I think he had a case of the nerves. Although we were thus disqualified, I prevailed upon Dave to allow me to argue both sides of the issue so that I could be considered for the national team, which I was fortunate enough to make and which started me out on a career of oratory. I'll always well remember Bill Weiner explaining the fruit of the poisonous tree, and Otto Stockmeyer the intricacies of contract law, and Ron Trosty how to pierce the corporate veil. Every time I go into court and try a case, I know that I am secure in my knowledge of the basic rules of evidence, thanks to Elliot Blixman. I have fond memories of all of you, those I've mentioned and those I have not, and I thank each and every one of you from the bottom of my heart for what you have meant in my life. You are truly the heart and soul of this law school. Now for some platitudes. What does it mean to be a lawyer?